Welcome everyone to this evening's conversation. It's wonderful to be having a face-to-face conversation, if a little bit strange. You're not going to be able to check your emails without getting busted quite quickly. You're not going to be able to put yourself on mute, so we will hear what you say. But really looking forward to this evening's conversation. It's with Rupert Wieloch and his excellent new book on liberating Libya. And I think, you know, for many of you, I'm sure, who have followed Libya closely, or those who have been and covered the story, you'll know that it's a fascinating one, but a complicated one. It's one that's kind of receded from the public, public eye, really. Although a lot's been going on, and I'm sure that we'll get to discussion about some of the latest developments in Libya towards the end of the discussion. We're going to start off, though, talking about Rupert's book, which kind of masterfully provides a tour de force from about the year BC to now. So you're just the 2000 years or so that you're covering, but principally from the late 19th century. And I think what the book does very interestingly is explore Libya from the perspective of British-Libyan relations. So it tells us a little bit about Britain, it tells us a little bit about Libya, and also quite a lot in between and what's going on. So delighted to chair this discussion. My name's Tim Eaton. I'm a senior research fellow at Chatham House, where my research focuses on the Libyan conflict. And Rupert brings a wealth of experience of Libya on the ground at some pretty key moments. And so really looking forward to the discussion. I'm gonna ask some questions about the book, and then after a little bit of time, we'll open it up. But if you have a burning question you want to be heard, raise your hand and we'll definitely bring you in. Keen to make this as much of a discussion as possible. So Rupert, without further ado, then let's kick off. I understand that the idea for this book first came to you when you were in Libya in 2011, working with the British government. Why was that? And what's the concept of the book from your perspective? To what extent is this a book about Libya? To what extent is it about Britain? A bit of both.
Thank you, Tim, and good evening, everyone. I have to start by saying I feel passionately about Libya, and I absolutely love the country. I believe the wonderful beaches, the stunning archaeology, Greek, Roman, Arab, and Berber, and the wonderful people who are polite. There's no sectarian divide there. There is so much going for the country that it should be on everyone's wish list to go to. And yet it is riven by this continuing civil war, which is really tragic. And that we should really sort of be supporting it. When I went out there in 2011, I looked for a book which would tell me about the Anglo-Libyan relationship. I knew bits and pieces, but wherever I looked, it was covered in piecemeal fashion. So there were quite a lot of World War II books about the Libyan campaign, but they were very technical and specific about the fighting rather than putting it into a political context. And it wasn't even linked to what happened in the First World War with the Zanussi campaign and the famous Duke of Westminster's rescue of 100 Royal Navy prisoners in Libya. And then as I scratched the surface a little bit more, I found these extraordinary stories of the exploration of Libya in the 19th century. The Beachy brothers, which was 200 years ago, Smith and Porcher, who were the first real excavators of the wonderful site in Cyrenaica. And I've discovered that there was this very long Anglo-Libyan friendship, and that it was really founded with the early days, with a friendship with the Zanussi after the First World War, established by a diplomat called Milo Talbot, who became a friend of the Emir and then King of Libya. And he established the groundwork for a tremendous relationship, and then freeing Libya from the Mussolini's brutal fascist regime in the Second World War, which occurred in 1943, and then helping Libya becoming an independent country in the 1950s. At that stage, Libya wished to partner principally with its neighbor Egypt, but the price Egypt asked was too high. So Libya then reverted to its British friends and established 20 years of friendship. And it was only when the oil was discovered in 1958-59 and the Arab-Israeli wars polarized the Libyan people that Gaddafi took his opportunity to form the Revolutionary Command Council and take over in a coup in 1969.
Thank you, Rupert. So I think as your first response there illustrates, there's actually quite a long history of British-Libyan relations. Britain's played different roles at different times. And I think it's kind of not very commonly known, because I think for the most part, people's associations with Libya stretch back to Gaddafi, but not much before. So much of the first part of your book looks at the history of Libya up until the First World War. So where would you put British relations and with Libyan actors, even if there is not, of course, a sovereign Libya at that point? How would you characterize those relations?
Well, I think just before getting to the First World War, I think again reinforcing this message of the close ties. I toured all the Commonwealth War cemeteries in Libya. There are 4 of them, and a garrison cemetery in Benghazi. It's not just British, it's also all the allies, Czechs, Poles, Australians, New Zealand, Canadian, are all buried there. And if you reckon that there are over 10,000 allied soldiers who are buried in Tobruk, Benghazi, and Tripoli, and how many people have uncles or grandfathers or fathers who served there, actually it means that there is a very strong personal connection. For many of you might have a relation who served in Libya or was born in Libya in one of the military hospitals there. Looking further back at the Italian-Ottoman War in 1911, up until that stage, Britain's role had been a traditional role of preventing France from taking control of another North African colony. We had supported the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan with the Pasha with 3 tails, and the Sultan who looked after Libya at the time, with some colourful and outstanding British ambassadors in the 19th century. But we were very much hands-off. And in the meanwhile, Italy decided that they wanted to recolonize what they called the fourth shore, the third shore being on the Balkan coast to the Adriatic. So the Libyan coast was the fourth shore, and they invaded in 1911, and they had a huge technical advantage. They had Marconi with his communications for the first time. It was the first war that had that saw land, sea, and air combined together, and yet they failed to establish anything other than a few core centres around the cities. But the interior was still held by the Ottomans, the Libyans, the Arabs, the Berbers, and the Zanussi, who fought them throughout the next 10 years. But we did play a part. We played a very big part, and it was the British journalists and war correspondents who cut their teeth before they then went on to become famous in the First World War, who wrote extraordinary books, and obviously the correspondence, whether it was Reuters, whether it was the predecessors of the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Illustrated London News, they were all out there. Some were ex-MPs. One who's a particular hero of mine, Francis McCulloch, was perhaps the man who brought the massacres of the Italians, of the Arabs in the souk, which changed public perceptions, which changed British government policy. And there was a British soldier who was actually the first individual to alert the world to the massacre that took place in the souk in 1911. anyway, that's all in the book. But so what I'm saying to you is that there is a very strong tradition from a British point of view of helping Libyans to fight off oppressive regimes.
And certainly, I think that's notable today when you look at, and we'll get to this later, relationships with Libyan actors. Britain doesn't have the colonial legacy that it has in some other states, and has a lot of goodwill and a lot of good memories from this period, not least the period where Libya moves towards independence. And what can you tell us about Britain's role in supporting that process? You noted as well, of course, that at the time of Libya's independence, Libya still hasn't found oil. It's not the wealthy state that it is today. So how did Britain engage around in that era? You noted as well, I think, in the book that Britain kind of became the partner of choice for Libya at that point, notably the Senussi. So could you talk us through those dynamics?
Yes, so in 1943, after Rommel and the Italian army was kicked out of Libya, the British administrators had a difficult job of reconstructing and bringing humanitarian aid to the Libyans and sorting out the mess that the war had left in their country. And a number of administrators came up, mainly from actually with experience from Sudan. And I'm very conscious that the term Orientalist and its counterpart Occidentalist are discredited now in terms of stereotyping people in a way which might be seen to demean them. But nevertheless, the British, there was some success with the British administrators who always saw their goal as being an independent Libya. But the question was, how would they join it all up? And there had been an effort of a republic in the First World War, the Tripolitanian Republic, but there'd also been the model in the east of the Cyrenaic and the Senussi Emir. And that was the one that the British administrators favored over the Republican model. And it was successful in as much as it brought the a very well-respected emir, the Senussi emir, Idris, to the throne, and it became a monarchy and a kingdom. Again, some people may not approve of the model of a monarchy, but the one that they envisaged was similar to the one in Jordan and Oman, which continues to be successful to this day. So it's not necessarily a discredited model of governance. The United Nations was also instrumental in bringing Libya its independence, and a UN administrator the final year before the independence came about in 1951. And the first reaction that the Libyans wanted was to partner with their neighbor, Egypt. But the price that Egypt asked was too high. One of the things they asked for was the holy oasis of Jadbul, which is the Senussi university town, which was disputed from the times of when it was when they were both Ottoman vilayets, and that was too much for the Libyans, and therefore they reverted to seeking help from Britain. And so there was an agreement which allowed British troops, British diplomats, British explorers to continue. The film industry thrived in the 1950s, and indeed after Suez, it was the go-to place for Hollywood and Ealing Studios if they wanted to make any film about the desert. So this was all fine until oil was discovered, and then that catapulted Libya into a different type of country. Before then, Britain had backed it financially. If you look at the American commentary of Libya at the time, it's full of how it's propped up by British money. But then once oil was discovered, the different dynamics, the the different tensions of people who sought power and money started increasing. And this combined with the propaganda which came in from Egypt and the growing Arab nationalism and disquiet with Israel, building up to the 1967 war, which was a watershed in many ways between the relationship between Libya and the West.
Thank you. I think that brings it to a really important point, because you're tracing some big historical trends here. Nasser's Arab nationalism, the voice of the Arabs pumping out over the airwaves, the need to liberate from colonial oppressors, and the story in Libya where the monarchy had quite a functional relationship with international oil companies, where there were, however, big problems to transition from an agrarian agricultural economy to this new economy, and problems of corruption, of rentierism, of empowering only certain elements of the Libyan populace, which I think Gaddafi really was able to seize upon in that popular moment. But also illustrating that Libya was a very new state at this point. It hasn't had a long time to consolidate its historic regions. It's notable that in that period, the parliament used to rotate across the country and wasn't just set in Tripoli, with Benghazi being seen as on a par with Tripoli. But following the Gaddafi, following Gaddafi's takeover from the RCC, rather, because effectively Gaddafi conducts a bit of a coup within a coup several years in, you see a very different posturing from Libya towards external states, and Britain, a hostility towards the presence of British troops. So how would you characterize the relations between the UK and the Gaddafi era authorities within Libya? What kind of change, what stayed the same?
Well, again, the principal relationship at the time was oil, defense, and diplomacy when Gaddafi came in. We had an outstanding ambassador. My regiment happened to be the last regiment, which was based at El Adam, RAF El Adam, and they eventually were the last combat unit to leave in 1970. But there was still a defense treaty. There was still a number of contracts on the table when Gaddafi came in. A very big contract for tanks, for Bloodhound missiles. And it was only after two or three, perhaps less than that, years that Gaddafi's nature meant that the government at the time decided that they wouldn't continue with the defense relationship. So in the early 1970s, this widening of the gap between Libya and the old British friendship meant that Gaddafi sought other friends, and the easy port of call for him, certainly from a defense point of view, was the Soviet Union. And certainly from a British and American point of view, the dynamic, which I cover in the book, about how Gaddafi changed the relationship, the defense and security relationship, from primarily British and American to the Soviet Union in the 1970s is absolutely key. But even then, he wasn't a complete puppet of the Soviet Union, because he was more hero worshipping Nasser until he died, and more of a friend of Arab nationalism. But even then, he was a bit of a maverick, because he also focused on Africa as well. But certainly by the end of the 1970s, he had established himself as a supporter of the Palestinian regime and of international terrorism. He exported weapons to Northern Ireland, for example, to the Provisional IRA, which were used against the British Army. And then we come to the watershed moments of the murder of PC Yvonne Fletcher and the subsequent bombing of Lockerbie, which are covered in to my mind, not a very satisfactory way, because again, it's a bit of a tabloid oversimplification of what happened. The bombing of Lockerbie was related to the war in Chad. The war in Chad was related to his aspiration to become a nuclear power, to get nuclear weapons because of the uranium that's there. And when the French and the Americans supported the Chadians in taking the disputed Uzu strip away, he then bombed the Pan Am flight and also a French flight on its way to Paris, which is perhaps a little bit less known. But he was a maverick, yes. But at the same time, you could understand his logic from an Arab point of view in terms of an eye for an eye and the way he conducted his business. So one has to be very careful about portraying Gaddafi as a total loose cannon.
Certainly, I think there's a degree of calculation. Someone doesn't stay in power that long in Libya without having some political nous. I think one of the really fascinating, at least from the external observer's perspective, is to look at how Gaddafi restructures the Libyan state and the country. One academic described it as basically a series of radical experiments with administrative reorganization. So you see big changes. Those oil contracts that were in place with the international majors being Libyanized, private property effectively being abolished, many of the elites and the rich who are associated with the monarchy being forced out into exile. And then also following Lockerbie and these points, the Libyan economy hitting the downturn with the oil markets and then struggling, really struggling, where you start to see uprisings against Gaddafi from within the Libyan state, a tribal uprising from the army, and you see Gaddafi restructure the state once again, to the point where it kind of gets somewhere in the 2000s where you're not really sure what it is. Everything's a part of the state. You have to be a so-called man of the tent to have access to power. But they're also trying to implement some reforms, some liberal reforms. When oil surpluses start again in the early 2000s, you see a different posturing from Libya. And then you see another outreach from Britain. So you talk about this a little in the book. And so how do you think at this point, principally, I guess, the Blair government is known for that rapprochement with Gaddafi. What do you see as the drivers of that? How did that unfold?
Well, I think you said it quite correctly, that the sanctions did have a big effect on Gaddafi. There were still some oil connections, getting in, getting out. There were people from Britain who were friends of Gaddafi's who were allowed in and reported back and wrote books about him. I believe there was a program made escorting Yvonne Fletcher's mother, Queenie, to meet him in the tent in the desert. So these were happening in the 1990s, but the economic sanctions were biting. And as you say, with the Blair government, which came in, the opportunity was there to find a compromise with Lockerbie. And so the Scottish trial in Holland, in many ways, bridged an important gap. And then 9/11 really changed everything. Gaddafi realized that he was next on the list, on the axis of evil after Saddam Hussein. And as a result of that, he allowed his son, Saif, to begin conduct the negotiations to give up his nuclear weapons and his nuclear capability. And that in many ways was the key to unlock the international rapprochement in the early 2000s. And again, I've got a photograph of the nuclear material being flown out in C-17 out to America in the book from the British ambassador, who was very gracious in helping me with the research at that time. So it was a very important time, and again, more contracts came in. But underlying everything, there was still, I would say, a mistrust, a deep mistrust in America. There was still a huge expat Libyan people who would not trust him and advised against any deal. And then we've reached the Arab Spring, the momentous Tunisian emolument, and the revolution in Egypt, and then it hit Libya as well. But at that stage, one has to say that the Anglo-Libyan relationship in 2009, 2010, 2011 was very much on an even keel. There were an awful lot of tourists going out to Libya and enjoying them. Again, in my research, I came across a significant number of people who had family connections or were born there, who went back, and they said it was the time of their life, going back to Libya. So there was this dilemma. But at the same time, with the new coalition government, a new breed of civil servant in Whitehall, and a new attitude in terms of the Blair's wars being something of the past, plus the key moments in the early Arab Spring, which turned it from a revolution which was probably not going anywhere into something which was fully backed by the international community.
I've always felt that period and the interconnections between what's happening in Tunisia, what's happening in Egypt, has played a very significant role in British strategic decision-making in Libya. If you take Libya aside from that broader context, as you mentioned, relations weren't too bad. And actually, many within the Libyan state would contend that quite productive reforms were underway. They were clearly compromised in many ways, but there was movement in that sense. But clearly Libya gets dragged into the broader environment, and obviously there's significant unrest and unhappiness and opposition to the regime that ebbed below the surface in many parts of the country. So in that very fast-paced environment of February 2011, you were working with the British government at that point. How do you see the decisions that the UK made in that period, and what would you say, what would you point to, any missteps, or what could have been done differently at that point?
Well, I think before I go into that, I have to say that I have a background in working with the United Nations on their peace support operations. I was deployed to Bosnia in 1995, and then I worked on the Brahimi reforms, and was involved in some of the staffing towards the responsibility to protect, which was the key Millennium Doctrine, which was a way for the United Nations to address the concerns of the allowing genocide on their watch in Rwanda and in Bosnia in 1995. So the responsibility to protect was very important to people. And you have to have that in mind as being agreed amongst all the nations before 2011. So when people listened in to the radio communications of Gaddafi and his son, and heard the same sort of words that they heard in Rwanda before the genocide there, the international community believed that it had to do something. In my personal opinion, I saw the burnt out tanks that were heading up the road to Benghazi, which were going to crush the revolution in its infant stage. And I have having spoken to many Libyans, I have no doubt that it would have crushed it if, and there would have been terrible retribution on Libyans if the international community hadn't acted in February and March and April under the guise of responsibility to protect. That was fine up until April, but then we got the complications. So I've got some few quotes. I've done a sort of the Libyan revolution in 13 quotes. Yeah, I won't go through all of them, but just to sort of remind ourselves of what was happening at the time. Perhaps the first one is a reminder that it wasn't just the West. The Arab League has officially requested the UN Security Council to impose a no-fly zone against any military action against the Libyan people. This is Amr Moussa, the Secretary General of the Arab League, on the 12th of March, 2011. And then Hillary Clinton announces that a massacre in Benghazi has been prevented. That was on the 24th of March. So this indicates this fast-flowing conflict that was taking place. And then perhaps one of the mistakes or the missteps, the strategic view from the French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé, when he said the destruction of Gaddafi's military capability is a matter of days or weeks, certainly not months. And how that proved to be wrong, because Gaddafi was much stronger than envisaged. He did have still some international support and international help. And we got to a stalemate, 26th of July. Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are generally in a stalemate. And this was, by then, we'd already crossed the watershed from it being a responsibility to protect purely humanitarian action authorized by the United Nations to one of the gray area of regime change, which no government will admit to, but which effectively had to take place because Gaddafi wasn't going to give up, and he wasn't going to give up what he had secured in terms of his military capability, and the weight of his capability would probably mean that the gains of the revolutionaries, who still didn't have a single chain of command at that time, would be taken out piecemeal. So the decision was taken in the Western governments to continue and extend the NATO mission until Gaddafi was overthrown.
Given as well that we're at the Frontline Club, I mean, we'll all remember those times, heady times in 2011, the coverage that we saw of the protests, the coverage that we saw of Libya, of the war, of people mobilizing, of the citizenry in Misrata under siege. What role did the reporting that came from Libya play in framing this conflict for the British public, do you think?
Well, I think it's that wonderful tradition of British war reporting, which is to highlight where things are going wrong. And as I mentioned, the war correspondents in 1911 did it. They did it very well, and the correspondents in 2011, 100 years later, almost to the day, reported on the same thing. Where I think they went slightly over the top was the warnings about complete chaos, humanitarian disaster, disease, cholera, and all these sort of things, which I had a friend who went out there and actually did an assessment of what the situation was. And actually the situation on the ground was never that dire in terms of the humanitarian crisis. And the threat was much more the one that I mentioned, which was of Gaddafi killing tens of thousands of people. I don't think he'd done that many before, but there were certainly cases during his 40 years in charge of the country where he had done it. Places like Misrata, there's the Museum of the Martyrs, where you can see the disappeared from the Gaddafi regime. And certainly at that stage, the war reporting was essential to bring to the public what was happening on the ground. And of course, by then we had crossed into the new digital age, where handheld cameras enabled people to have instant images, which was what the Arab Spring was all about.
Yes, I mean, some really iconic images from that period of the flags, the revolutionary flags reappearing, of people mobilizing. As you mentioned, the war kind of had a couple of phases: an initial momentum from the rebels, a fight back from the regime, and then quite a grisly end. And at that point, as you note, the military elements of the rebel movement are not integrated, and they have some connection to the civilian elements and the political representation, but actually much of that political representation remained outside of Libya. The scale of the challenge before those respective groups was pretty massive at the point of Gaddafi's demise in October of 2011. And I think here, British policy and certainly Western policy, there's somewhat of a tendency to fight the previous war. There was a nervousness about being tied down in Libya, being stuck with the product, a kind of perhaps a perceived urge to get out quickly, to leave this to the Libyans. In your book, you make some critical comments about how Western states position themselves in the post-2011 period. But you also note that the keenness of the National Transitional Council, that Libyan government, to take over was also something that meant that some of the offers of help that were provided by the internationals weren't taken up. So looking at that period in retrospective, what do you think of what are the lessons that we should learn from that, and what could have been done differently, do you think, at that point?
Well, if I may, I will read a passage, not that I wrote, but Professor Chris Donnelly, who wrote the introduction, actually visited Libya on behalf of the Stabilization Unit and wrote a report. So I'm going to read out a little passage that he's written in the book, which I think answers this question. In early 2012, I deployed to Libya as part of a team from the UK government's Stabilization Unit to support our ambassador's sterling efforts to help the Libyans gain control of the very chaotic internal security situation that had developed after the death of Gaddafi. My mission report drew attention to the lack of strategic thinking in government, the failure to have a restoration plan to follow the military operation, and Whitehall's inability to understand the urgency of taking action. I wrote, "The situation will not be improved by a series of tactical initiatives, however well-intentioned and well-funded, unless a process appropriate to the circumstances can be devised and introduced. Then we must steel ourselves to sit back and wait for a renewal of the conflict and accept the loss of whatever influence and prestige in the region of the UK had acquired as a result of our past military intervention." The report was acknowledged, but too little was done too late. And after the murder of the US ambassador and the attempted assassination of the British ambassador, any remaining enthusiasm for action rapidly dissipated. What I had feared indeed came to pass. And that was certainly my reflections, my observations at the time. Some of it was part of the West's quick abandonment after the death of Gaddafi. So, for example, the NATO mission ended on the 31st of October. On the 1st of November, there was a new mission from Operation Alamy. It became Operation Vocate. I was the 50th British Army or Royal Air Force service man to go out to Libya, and I looked after the British element with the ambassador Dominic Asquith, who did a fantastic job. And what we tried to do was join up the pieces out there into an integrated approach from, we had a wonderful leader of the DFID team, the Foreign Office team and the MOD team. And we had quite a few important projects, whether that was dealing with the remnants of war, we were searching for the surface-to-air missiles. Libya, Gaddafi had bought 25,000 surface-to-air missiles, and we were trying to find them. We had teams going around the country for that. We also had to do things like reassess where we evacuated people from, the air bases and that sort of thing, and also help the Libyans in what they were doing. And this was absolutely key, where from my point of view, there was too much nagging and not enough assistance. And there's a big difference between advice and assistance. On the advice, you're standing back, you're looking at somebody's work and you're pointing the finger to say, do better. That's not what we should have been doing. We should have been assisting at their request, helping them, sitting next to them, right there in all their various ministries. It wasn't just the Ministry of Defense, it was the reconstruction side of things, Ministry of Interior. They wanted us to do that. Unfortunately, they didn't allow the letters of agreement. Foreign countries need some form of legal cover to allow them to work in another country. That was a hold up, but nevertheless, the capability wasn't ready and able to get in, other than a bare minimum. The United Nations had responsibility for reconstruction. The European Union had responsibility for border security, both of which I'm afraid the UN did a very good job in recovering the final nuclear capability from Libya. But other than that, they missed the opportunity for security sector reform, and particularly one of the main security challenges, which continues to this day, of trying to involve and help the revolutionaries become involved in running the country. An education program, an employment program. These are the things that needed to be put in place immediately, and sadly are still not there now. And then there's the Constitution. Perhaps we'll go on to that.
Yeah, I think the Constitution it's still a very pertinent conversation right now. Actually, the way that the current political process seems to be pivoting is back towards agreeing a constitution first. I mean, I think it's important to note, isn't it, that perhaps I realise that framing the questions, failures and things that have gone wrong, because obviously we're talking from 2022, where we know the situation is pretty dire and unstable. We've seen at least 2 further outbreaks of civil conflict. We've seen a governance split with rival authorities emerge and tentatively be put back together, but not really. Very fragmented situation on the ground. But I think the quote of Professor Donnelly and the points that you've made over the need for a kind of strategic approach, an approach from the internationals that's not just piecemeal, that fuses the economic, the political, and the military, integrate in an integrated fashion, is something that you kind of called for in the book. So I wonder, from your perspective now, what does that look like with Libya in 2022?
Well, again, one of the reasons for writing the book was to highlight Britain's historic friendship, which places Britain in a much better position than the other members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council and arguably its neighbours to help Libya. And a peaceful future, to my mind, depends on a rapprochement between the rival governments in Tobruk and Tripoli. So that's something that Britain's friendship with Libya, I think, would be number one on the list of priorities. If I had £1 for every Libyan, and I went around all over Libya, Misrata, Bani Walid, Sirte, Benghazi, Tobruk, Zawiya, Zintan, and wherever I went, there were Libyans who said that their father, their uncle, or their grandfather fought with the British in Tobruk. Now, they couldn't have all have done that. And I know that some of them actually fought with the Axis troops. They were forced to. But nevertheless, the sentiment was there for wishing Britain to get involved. So as I say, the diplomacy that's required to bring Tripoli and Tobruk back together again. And I sat down and had lunch with the Tobruk government when I was there. They're very friendly, much more traditional than the Tripoli government in many ways. But a compromise can be found. And I believe Britain is the right interlocutor for that, to finesse that deal with careful diplomacy. And really it starts from there. From a constitution point of view, I was asked by the Chief of Defence and Defence Minister Donnelly in 2012 to help them draft their first defence white paper. And there are 4 questions which you have to address before you can do anything in terms of establishing the right relationship between the military and the security forces and the civilian government. And it has to be a Libyan answer. The Libyans have to answer these questions. They have to decide on these, and they're sort of traditional questions. Who do you want to run the armed forces? Do you want a model like America, where the president is commander-in-chief, or do you want something where there is a much more of a sort of a committee type of approach, as in Britain? What is the relation? What is the role of the military? Do you want Turkey or Pakistan in terms of a Muslim state where the military has an actual role in terms of stepping in if the government becomes corrupt or something like that? Again, this is something that they have to choose and lay down in the constitution. One of the key questions is the relationship between what I would describe as the Revolutionary Guard and the traditional armed forces. So in Libya, when I was there, they had 4 services. They had the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the Air Defence. The Air Defence was a separate 4th pillar of defence under the Chief of Defence Staff. You just have to sort of make sure that there's a relationship in terms of a construct between the Chief of Defence Staff and the Ministry of Defence. But do you want a Revolutionary Guard that comes in between? Or does the Revolutionary Guard come between the President and the MOD? This is absolutely fundamental in establishing what sort of country you're going to have, whether it's going to go down the authoritarian route or whether you're going to go down the more democratic civilian governance sort of structure. But these are the questions that they have to ask, and we did get some answers. When I saw the draft constitution, they had been missed out, certainly the answers that they came up with, the people who were in charge in 2012. But without those being addressed in the constitution, you're not going to make the necessary progress. So there's important work to be done, which the international community can help with by showing models, helping the reintegration into the international community, apart from all the other aspects in terms of the business, the economic, the commercial, the reconstruction, the infrastructure, and all that sort of thing, which are there as well. But if you don't get your security right, then you're not going to get the stability. If you don't get the stability, you're not going to get the political changes in the political governance.
Very interesting to probe that, the security rubric as well. I'm keen to get to your questions, so please be ready. I've just got one more before I come to you. But finally, I think you've hinted towards it there, but there's a real difference between the way that you refer to some of the explorers and the administrators of the 19th century and some of those intrepid adventurers in the early 20th century, with the nature of the engagement that you described post 2012 in Libya. So I wonder, what do you think the UK should be doing in Libya that it isn't doing right now? And is there really the political will for the role that you would like the UK to play?
Two very different questions. What should we be doing? We should have a presence. We haven't got, the embassy isn't there. All the people who were with me, you know, they might fly in and out from Tunisia, but we need to re-establish a presence in Tripoli and in Tobruk. And I believe we're the right people to do that. Do we have the political appetite? I think I find that ever since 2013 and the vote not to support the American intervention in Syria, when the red line was drawn with the Assad gassing his own people, I find it difficult to envisage many scenarios where the current government or the government in the immediate future will deploy British troops in anger. And I'm very conscious that there's something going on in the East where, which is attracting their attention at the moment. But, you know, Tripoli is closer to London than Athens is. You know, it's Kharkiv, in the second largest city in Ukraine, is 100 miles further than Tripoli is. Tripoli is actually a really important, Libya is a really important country, both in terms of its leadership in North Africa, but also crossing the culture between the Arab states and the African states. And it's a Mediterranean state. The problem is that the media today does tend to stereotype it as either previously a pariah state, or at the moment a source of illegal migration or terrorism, the Manchester Arena bombing. It doesn't really get in the news for that. So I plead with you all out there that that you should put a slightly different perspective on Libya to help it out of its difficulties, because it can get out of its difficulties. I'm sure in 15 years' time it will be a wonderful country again, and tourists will be going there, and we'll all be saying, what was all the fuss about? But at the moment it is in dire need of assistance and help, and I believe the media can play its part in giving a fair portrayal of it, not just as a place that is a source of migration, which is a security threat to Europe and Britain, and bombers who bomb our events.
Well, I think I've used my time and abused my position to ask enough questions. I'll collect a couple of questions from the room if anybody has one. I see a gentleman over here.
Thank you very much indeed. I made plenty of notes. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former colleague of Chris Donnelly, and I very much recognise what you quoted from. That is very much. I've worked in several EU border assistance missions, mainly in ex-Soviet states, Ukraine, Moldova, and I was approached, and somebody mentioned, are you going to apply for the EU BAM mission in Libya? I said, no, it is mission impossible. I know some people in charge probably got impossible task, but they are not. This is a long solution. And we're now seeing shenanigans with the Director General of Frontex. It's just another example of that saga. So thank you on that one. My question is, where does the South fit in on this? Is the South with Tripoli or Tobruk, or is the South? And what momentum to get the West involved in to help has the proxy war of the drones, Wagner and Wagner's Turkish equivalent that amounts to. Can we wake people up in the West to start providing? I first covered Wagnerism 23 years ago.
Thank you. Question here.
I don't want to interrupt the writing.
No, I'm listening.
Okay. I've got two questions. One of them is relating to when Libya switched its defence supplies from the UK basically to the Soviets. Was that a failure of the British, or was it a sort of indication of the workings of bigger forces than that? And the second question is, you didn't mention the Belhaj affair. Could you maybe put the Belhaj affair into the context of what else you were talking about, like sort of British as a non-colonial power in Libya, and also in the context of the Manchester Arena, where you had a very, even though evidence at the inquiry has been very sketchy, there was quite a lot of evidence of direct British intelligence involvement in infiltrating Libyan exiles back into Libya, which is sort of the similar sort of meddling as there seems to have been with the Belhaj case, but didn't reflect particularly well on the UK.
Okay, yeah, do you want to start with those two sets of questions?
I need to do those other. I won't remember the others. Ewan, thanks very much for that. I don't believe it's mission impossible. I believe what you need is a dynamic mobile force equipped with modern digital communication systems. And again, they might like to have some assistance in doing that. But that's the practical solution. Berlusconi provided 500 million euros for border security. They put some cameras out, but they didn't didn't join it up. And so I would say it's not mission impossible. It's a difficult task. You've got to accept that it will still be a porous border, but you can start to take the problem from where it is now, which is sitting on the coast and in the middle of the Mediterranean, towards where it should be, which is closer to the source of the migration. I think Wagner and the Russians against the Turks proxy war is a sort of with the sooner we get out of that, the better. But I believe it's a symptom rather than a cause. And I will go back to what I said in terms of the causes. We need a diplomatic solution. The diplomatic solution is getting Tobruk and Tripoli together, and you need accomplished diplomats to do that. We used to have accomplished diplomats. I won't name them in the 1990s, but we used to have some grandees who would do exactly that. I had some help with a book from David Cameron, and I use his quote from his own book, which is that the Foreign Office lost its sense of can-do at that time, and we need to get that back. And again, Christopher Donnelly addresses that in his introduction. In terms of I wouldn't want to lay blame for the British government at the time for ceasing to provide arms to Gaddafi in 1970-71. The end of the tank contract was a very difficult situation. It was related to the contract that we were providing Centurion tanks to Israel, and that our defense minister at the time was worried. We were just introducing a new tank called a Chieftain tank to the British Army, and it was more capable than the Centurion tank. And the British government was worried about outmatching in terms of the Arab-Israeli tension. And they preferred to sit on their hands and do nothing, unlike the French, who were quite happy to continue to arm Gaddafi in the early 1970s. So what they didn't want, the British priorities were twofold in 1970 in terms of relationship with Libya. One was to try and prevent a conflagration in the Middle East, and the second was to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining a foothold, remembering that we were still in the middle of the Cold War, prevent it from getting a foothold. So there was still work that was done, but Libya's relationship with the Soviet Union was a bit like NASA's, where he was quite happy to buy cheap equipment, but he didn't want to give them control of their country. And so in that sense, we were happy with the way it went in the early 1970s. And there was still a very strong relationship in terms of the oil economy. And I think I do quote exactly what proportion of GDP we were involved in before Yvonne Fletcher was murdered in the book, but I haven't got it to my head. And it wasn't until, I've met ex-RAF pilots who continued to fly for Gaddafi in the 1980s until 1984. So there was still a relationship. It just wasn't as strong and as close as it was under King Idris. Again, I cover the Belhaj and the intelligence side of things in detail in the final part of the book. I think it was a huge mistake not to admit immediately the fact that we were involved in his rendition, and not to apologise and provide compensation in 2011. I met him and spoke to him in Christmas Day 2011 at a disarmament conference in Tripoli, and I thought it was really important to continue a dialogue. He was going to be really influential. He is really influential in Tripoli, and we needed to get alongside him. And I think it was a big mistake. It was all related to the intelligence sharing. It's all in the book.
I wondered a couple of things. I think Mo mentioned on the connection to the Manchester arena bombing, whether you've seen similar types of UK intelligence services strategies towards engaging with the Libyan. Do you see some similarities? I think the implication of your question was that perhaps you see some of the same infiltration taking place today as then. Is that something that you've noticed? I mean, I would just add as a fun aside that one of the more interesting ironies after the Brits left Tripoli is that when they flew back, they kept flying back on Belhaj's aircraft, so they were being rendered back into Libya by Belhaj, which I quite enjoyed. But anyway, would you like to come on back either on the intelligence point? And I think another one that was mentioned by Ewan is the South. I think this raises that big classic question of Libya: who represents whom? Another aside, the former special representative Ghassan Salameh, when he was trying to hold a so-called national conference to bring together probably around 200 Libyans to debate over what should happen to the political process, nobody could get the list off him. And it was very difficult to understand. We're trying to work out who would be on this list. And he ended up having 16 different categories to try and cover in some way the constituencies that would need to be involved in a deal, which I think explains to you some of the complexities of the negotiations process in Libya and complicates the idea that you can cut a deal between two governments, particularly because the incumbents of those positions have prioritized their own existence and staying in office over those broader strategic deals. But where do you see that kind of issue, particularly in the South? Do you see the South, as Ewan ventured, or do you see potential clear alliances forming with either Tripoli-based entities or entities in the East?
So I take the South more to be the region, the Fezzan, which after the war was administered by the French. The border, the gateway to the south on the western side is Gaddafi. I went down there and I spoke to the leader of the Tuareg tribe, and there are 7 tribes in Gaddafi, and there was an uneasy relationship at that stage, but nevertheless they were speaking to each other, and the Tuareg own, I would characterize it as the Tuareg owning and indeed the Taboo in the east on the Kufa side. The Tuareg own the valleys and the desert, and the 7 tribes own the oasis. The Tuareg earn their money by bringing goods, transporting goods from one side of Africa to the other. And it doesn't really matter what they transport, they will take whatever is the most expensive, which tends to be illegal contraband, whether that's missiles or drugs or whatever. And then they get to the oasis and they trade it in the oasis, and then it continues up and down. So the relationship in terms of the tribal relationship, is very, very traditional, predates our, certainly the Arab invasion, going back thousands of years to the time of Ramesses, when Libya was a hard place to live and the tribes first went in there. Life hasn't changed little for these people. They don't have their camel caravans anymore, they're all on towed trucks, but the principle of what they do and what their symbiotic relationship with the people of the oasis is pretty much the same. But I think that also brings an important point. The leader of the Gaddafi council, who I met, had been in Abu Salim jail under Gaddafi and tortured. He now had a brother who was in the NTC, and his sister was married to the leader of the Tobruk Council. So a refrain I heard a lot was, "We are all cousins. We don't want to fight each other." And underlying this, I think I said at the beginning, there is no religious divide in Libya. And this is a tremendous advantage in terms of negotiating. And it's the old ways, which, again, if you read what I wrote about Smith and Porcher in terms of how they related and integrated with the local tribes in Cyrenaica, this is the way to do it. And you can understand how the relationships, you have to obviously go at their pace, but if you do, then you are rewarded with trust, and if you get trust, then they will start to compromise a little bit. At first, everything is on the extremes, but eventually you find areas where there is compromise. Fascinating dynamic, and again, I feel that there is a possibility for good diplomats, old school diplomats perhaps, to find a way to bring them together, because they are all related.
Thanks. I was looking for some time at different armed factions, and I noted one in the south where one brother had his armed group affiliated with the Tripoli authorities, and the other brother had the armed group affiliated with the Eastern authorities. It was the same group of men who had 2 sets of salaries, a lot of transactionalism as well going on. More questions? I bring you in.
I think what I have is more of a comment and discussion rather than a question. I'm a Libyan national. I was born and raised in Tripoli. I came here a couple of years ago. You were touching base a lot on the diplomatic solution and the having that dialogue between Tripoli and Tripoli. But I feel like, at least within my circles and the tone, the general consensus within my circles, again, is that there's a bit of a distaste for British intervention, because the fashion in which it has been carried throughout history going back to times of Susi and then again revolution. It's always been you go in, you meddle a little bit, and then you retreat. Not sure why, but it has been the case. And then it's Susi and being Barca, yeah. Him being from Barca, and him initially, originally being an Algerian national, and then being imposed on 3 different regions that historically speaking were not the same country. Oya was Libya, Tripoli, and then Kazan with all its complexity, culture. So I just wanted to hear about that.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of truth in what you're saying about Britain doing something and then backing off. But I think that is well-meaning, because what we're not trying to do is to run your country for you. And there comes a time when I said that we shouldn't be advising, we should be assisting. But there comes a time when the Libyan people have to stand up for themselves and run their own country for themselves. And we thought that moment had come. We were told by the Libyans that moment had come in November, December 2011. And there was a very strong message coming from the National Transitional Council and many Libyans that we can cope, we can do with it, we can do this on our own. And it wasn't until 3 months later that they came to us and said, actually, we do need help, and this is our shopping list. Al-Kib, the Prime Minister? I'm talking about the British embassy staff. So we had about 40 people there. And wherever we went, we still had, obviously, the British Council, which was there throughout the revolution, what we don't want to do is to impose an authoritarian way of doing things. Provide you with the options for you to make your choices, and then allow you to stand up for yourselves. As I said before, it has to be a Libyan answer to these things. But there are certain things in terms of international relations which need to be put in place if we are going to be in Libya, like, for instance, the letter of agreement, which provides some form of legal framework so that countries can have their diplomats in your country safely. I don't think I can say very much more than that.
Would you like to come back, just because one thing is noted quite regularly by Libyans I speak to, is that quite a lot of our discussions about what the internationals could do to help the process. Where do you see the international community fitting into that, and where do you see the space for an actual meaningful Libyan-led process here? Because that's not talked about.
There's no right answer. We don't know what is the best way forward. But when you're looking at the general public, I find that the international government that has the best, ironically, the best perception of the lives of Libyans actually is Italy, because in their mind, we've messed up once, we're not messing up again. So I would say we're a bit polarized, depending on where you are, depending on what your socioeconomic background within Libya is. So I don't have the answer, but I would say that is my opinion. I would support an Italian approach, a current Italian approach to economic.
Okay. Next question.
Do you think Gaddafi was the lucky bomber? If the answer is no, then who do you think did?
I'll collect a couple of questions. There's a gentleman behind us. Yes.
I was going to ask, actually, what is the role of the former colonial power Italy in Libya today? For example, Chatham House in France is very active in the West, in the Maghreb, and the Sahel. So,
okay, I'll take one more. Gentleman.
And I guess it's building on a theme that it is where we are now is there really a role for Britain as a single actor, or is it now an international community that needs to act, given the tensions and the recent developments before Christmas with,
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps let's start with the direct question about Megrahi, the whodunit question, because that's still, I think Lockerbie is going into a new phase at the moment, and then perhaps we can get to the international relations.
Yes, it's in the book. Yeah, and I had great help for the whole process of the Scottish legal system from the second ambassador to come back after the rapprochement, who was a Scot, and he explained the intricacies of the Scottish legal system, which actually sort of why one was let off and one was found guilty. Yeah, it's all in there.
On the questions of the internationals, I mean, Italy's an interesting one because Italy has a historic relationship with Italy, much of it quite bad. Also, you can get caught out when you go to Libya and you hear people use some Italian words when you're trying to work out the Arabic, like Samafro is apparently very confusing, but there are close links there. And Italy has a good understanding of what's happening in Libya. You can see through its energy interests, through its shuttle diplomacy, through some of its garrison. But at the same time, it's struggled, hasn't it? Because Italy itself is relatively unstable right now. It's had a continuing changes of governments, and it hasn't really been able to make its voice well heard within the EU, let alone beyond that. Its one summit was such a disaster in Libya. So where do you see Italy coming into this?
Well, I think I'd say three things about Italy. The first is they have most to lose for an unstable Libya. The second is that they have poured billions and billions and billions of euros into Libya to try and find solutions. And the third is that they are still, in a large proportion of the population of Libya, hated for the brutal fascist regime, the concentration camps, and everything else that they introduced, the pacification. One of the tremendous book that I was given when I was out there was Mohammed Fakini's Fight for Freedom, written by Angelo Del Bocco, which it explains a lot of what happened and why there is this distrust and dislike for Italy, why they can't really have a presence on the ground, even though they will pump money in. As an illustration of that, if you go to the Commonwealth War Grave in Tripoli, you have to go through the Italian cemetery, and the Italian cemetery has hardly got one gravestone which hasn't been vandalized, and yet you go through to the British cemetery and it is absolutely pristine and immaculate. And that's not to say that there wasn't vandalization in Benghazi of some British cemetery, but in Tripoli, all the Italian military gravestones have been desecrated. So it's a difficult one for Italy. I do understand, and actually, if you walk in the markets, ladies with hijab and Sophia Loren glasses are their style is much more tuned into Rome than it is to London. So I do understand that.
One thing that's notable is that a lot of things get shut down for political reasons in Libya. A lot of things are leveraged, but the things that are owned by any continue to run generally pretty well because they're very good local relations. And I think the Italians are good at that, but they've struggled to translate that into a more powerful position of leadership within the international community. You mentioned Britain there, and I wonder, from the historic engagement that Britain's had, it's probably had slightly closer links with elements native to the east of the country, from Cyrenaica, from Barca. And one of the things that seems to have been lost really since 2012, and I think you lament in the book, is that loss of presence, not just in Libya wholly, but particularly in the east, which kind of let the brakes off of some things that unfolded with the death of the assassination of the US ambassador, etc. When looking for a role for Britain, should we be looking at engaging in those types of areas? You've hinted towards the kind of broader political deal, but that feels quite unlikely because, you know, we can't even get a minister there at the moment. And, you know, when the current Prime Minister went there, his comments were not particularly helpful either. So, you know, what practically could Britain do in answer to the gentleman's question?
Yeah, and I think just clarifying, I didn't think Britain should do it alone. I don't. We can't do it alone. Very much as part of the international community under the UN framework, and I think it's tremendous news that Stephanie Williams has gone back there and has taken over as the UN in her UN role. But that has to be the international framework for which Britain can work. Should we do more in the East? I absolutely agree with that. And I was, again, I write about it in the book, I was devastated to have to pull out my British team from Benghazi shortly before, at the beginning of April 2012, shortly before the attacks started in there, which culminated in the death of Christopher Stevens. We lost our finger on the pulse, which we had in Benghazi, and it was with dire results. And I believe it was an entirely preventable assassination if we continued to commit what we had already there in April and continued our close relationship with all the leaders. We were tracking all the different militias in the East from the revolution, because we got to know them in the revolution. We've become friends with them. So we knew all the right contacts, and this was just the rug was pulled from under us in April. We lost our feel for what was going on. And as a result of that, first Ian Martin was attacked, and then Donnelly, and then Christopher Stevens.
I think perhaps got a chance for one or two remaining questions. If there's gentlemen there, any other questions? Okay, I'll let that be the last question, then answer that, and then perhaps you can wrap up. So
I was just going to ask you, on the present day, just the election
Tim actually is probably the one to answer this question more than me. I mean, tracking the election, it was always ambitious without a constitution, and the way it went. What did we have? 96 presidential candidates.
Yes.
And the three main ones that from the outside world, were described as one being a war criminal, Saif, one being a warlord, Haftar, and one being a dubious businessman in terms of the Prime Minister. I think there was some
a billionaire off a state salary is perhaps most apt description. Yes.
So there wasn't very much in terms of the satisfactory outcome, and there was a Chatham House event before the elections when the diaspora flipped and said, actually, we don't want the election now the way it's going. And up until that point, everyone was for it. It's disappointing that HNEC has said it's unlikely in the first half of this year. Again, it does need huge help from Stephanie Williams and from the international community to get it going. But there is a great danger that now it's been postponed once, it will drift, and that cannot be good for the country.
Yeah, just my 2 cents on that. I mean, I think it's an interesting question of how you see change happening, because the rationale for the elections is effectively that there needs to be a unified government to achieve certain things within Libya, services, to bring back functionality, to reform the security sector, for example. But to hold elections to produce a government is perceived by many of the rival actors as a zero-sum game, particularly off the disputed laws that the elections would be based. So if you win the presidency, you select the prime minister, you select the government. Those bounds effectively made that a zero-sum game among the rivals, so that they would much rather frustrate a process than potentially lose it. So the question's wrong, because the questions should be, what do you want the new government to be able to achieve? And that's where the constitutional question comes in. It puts us in a bit of a catch-22, because the incumbents of the positions have used that longer process to remain in post and not meaningfully engage. So that's the kind of inflection point we're at now, and the UN has to decide, does it try and push towards elections and just try and fix that framework in any way it can? Or does it engage in that broader state formation, state building process of the constitution, which is a track that Libya's already been on a decade and could be on a decade further without much progress. So I think that's a real dilemma. But I think fundamentally, my view is that they've got to move towards the elections and fix the framework so that you can make this change incrementally. I think the idea that you get everybody to agree on the constitution and it's just implemented is probably not how these things unfold. But anyway, last word to you, Rupert.
Well, I think I'd go back to what I originally said. Libya is a wonderful country. The people are polite. I think they're fantastic, and it deserves our attention and our support to get it out of the difficulties that they're in at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. Round of applause.